Hi, I'm Chris Greig-Bonnie, Scottish individual, studied at the University of Aberdeen, and currently working for a company called Serco as their head of commercial contracts for UK and Europe.
Thank you very much. Why did you choose to study at University of Aberdeen?
It was the rating of the law school, to be honest, was one thing. The second thing was I wanted to study modern languages at the same time as law.
Yes.
And Aberdeen offered the ability to study French law and Scots law together, which you couldn't find anywhere else. So that kind of plumped it for me. And I've got family from the northeast of Scotland, so I know Aberdeen well and enjoy it.
Thank you very much. And why did you choose to study law in particular?
So as I mentioned before, I've always had a bit of an affinity for language. So I speak five languages now. It's something I've always enjoyed, almost like collecting them. And I love the different ways you can say things and the analytics involved in how you can communicate. And law felt like a relatively natural move for me in terms of critical thought analysis and also debate, which I enjoyed from school as well. So yeah, it just seemed like a good choice.
Thank you very much. What did you find most challenging during your time as a student at University of Aberdeen?
Probably initially the adjustment when you've lived at home in a small village in Scotland for the first 18 years of your life, coming and living in a city is a bit of a culture shock, in all honesty. And the university experience is very different from the school experience as well. So I was very lucky that I managed to adjust into it relatively quickly, found good friends in halls and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, that was probably the biggest adjustment. Academically, it was probably the amount of independent study you've got to do around things. So it's not the same as being textbook fed for exams, which is very much the school experience. It's much more about how you take a theme and think about it. So once you get to grips with how to do it, it's good, but it takes a bit of adjustment to get there.
Thank you very much. Did you join any clubs or student organizations as a student?
So the club I was most involved with in the latter years of my time at Aberdeen was the squash club. I really enjoyed playing squash with them, and we went on a trip to Dublin actually to play squash down there at one point. I really enjoyed that. I got involved in some of the clubs around the Law Society, but a lot of the time was spending time with friends, and I think that was one of the best things of the university experience, just spending time with friends and doing your own thing. But the squash club was pretty good. I did enjoy that.
Thank you. Did you make any lifelong friendships or connections at university?
Yes, we we still have a WhatsApp group called the Aberdeen Survivors. So it's four guys who I lived with through halls and then later in flats and things like that. So we've attended each other's weddings. I was best man to one of them. They were they were my best man when I got married. So yeah, that's been going on. Christ, what am I now? 38. So that's been us friends almost 20 years.
Thank you very much. What is Serco?
What is Serco? So Serco is a company. It's a FTSE 250 company, headquartered in the UK, but has a global footprint. And we basically provide public services to the government or in support of the government. So we do everything from running hospitals and prisons to heavy rail operations. We run the Northlink ferry that goes between Aberdeen and Orkney and Shetland as well, for example, and a lot of work in support of citizen services. So our core things are we provide services from a public perspective to government and that have an impact on the citizen.
Thank you very much. And what is your current role at Serco?
So I'm the head of commercial contracts. What that basically means is Serco is effectively a contracting business. I mentioned we run services under contract for government for the benefit of the citizen. So I and my team of about 28, we are responsible for taking our contract portfolio commercially and legally from cradle to grave. So right when we identify a potential opportunity where we can support public services right through to the end of that contract and its exit or any rebids that come up, we are there providing that legal commercial support.
Thank you very much. How did you get into this company?
Oh, probably slightly by accident, to be honest. So when I first started working, after university, I did the classic legal qualification route. So I joined a firm, as was McClay, Murray and Spence, which I think is now part of a global firm, Dentons. I qualified into banking law there, which I didn't particularly enjoy, not really for me. And I went into the oil industry as a lawyer, and then I went into aviation in Aberdeen as a lawyer. And as part of the aviation company I was working in, we did what are called search and rescue public services. So when people are lost out hill walking or at
Yeah.
sea, we would provide helicopter support to go and find those people and help rescue them. And then the role at Serco came up. It was based in Brussels. My husband is French and we'd had children. And he wanted to move closer to family, and Belgium was quite close to
Yeah.
France and it's more accessible. So yeah, we took the plunge and moved across with Serco. There was a public services element of continuity with the
Yeah.
SAR into what Serco does. And yeah, I've been there ever since, doing different roles for the last probably about 8.5 years.
Thank you very much. And how is it different to work in your current company and, for example, at Baker Hughes? How is it different?
Well, I think sectorally it's different. So when you work in private sector or business to business type organizations, I would say that the accountability for financial decisions is very different. And what I mean by that is effectively what we are doing is receiving money to provide a service to the public. So the citizen and the citizen experience and benefit is very much at the center of what it is we do. And it's a core part of Serco in terms of our driver, which is to create positive impact, environmental, service perspective, or indeed just the value for money in terms of employing Serco to do things from a government standpoint. So I think the focus, the culture, and the ethos by Dint is very different. And
Yeah.
that drives different considerations when you're making decisions about how to best serve the needs of the customer, here government, but also the end customer, the citizen, which is very different from oil and gas.
What advice would you give to students trying to get an internship?
What advice? So don't be too myopic about what opportunities you want to go for. One of my perceptions as I move through my career is at a certain point, it's not just about the hard skills you have, it's about the skill stack you have. And a lot of that is driven by softer skills, your ability to negotiate, critically analyze, influence stakeholders, and actually having a variety of experience that's maybe not directly related to your core discipline actually is accretive to your ability to use those soft skills to advantage. So take that wider breadth view. And also think about how, when you're going into these conversations, you're not just talking about the fact that, well, I'm on track to get a 2-1 in my LLB. It's also about, I work at the same time as doing my studies, as I was doing. So there's an element of accountability and responsibility within that. I have other interests that show I am a more rounded person. Don't be afraid to bring those forward and think about the transferable skills it shows. And also when you're in there, how you can build on those and then take them with you as you're looking to go formally into work after internship happens.
Thank you very much. How is it different to work in Belgium and in UK?
Oh, so Belgium, I would say, is quite socialist at base. It's an interesting country because you have a real smash of cultures between the more Dutch Germanic sides of things and the more French side of things, with the Wallon and the Flemish. And that creates a very interesting, almost internal battle of cultures. I think it's because predominantly the French was very much stronger in the past. There is a high degree of socialism. So Belgium is, I think, the most highly taxed country in Europe, for example, but that manifests in a very different expectation for school, for costs of living, for health. And I think coming back to the UK, I see that we have this sort of in-between culture where it's heavily influenced by the capitalist relationships we have, for example, with America, also some of our history with the Conservatives in the 80s and 90s, but with that nod to socialism that we've seen particularly through the EU when we were in there as well. So it's a very different cultural expectation. And the other thing I would say is I find drinking culture in the UK very different from Europe as well. And the one thing I do miss is the ability to sit outside on terraces and just have a little drink and some nibbles. It's a very, very different kind of culture over here. But, they're both good in their own ways.
Thank you very much. And So, what are some major projects and most interesting for yourself that you've been involved throughout your career?
Oh, so the most interesting piece of work I was probably involved in. It was the most tiring because it was landing at the time my children were born as well. Um, it's a piece of American legislation called a Chapter 11, and basically what that means is as an organisation, the organisation moves through a managed shedding of debt effectively in order to right size its balance sheet and become competitive so it can continue trading. That was particularly interesting because it's a very American concept, and I worked in a company that had operations in Norway and in the Netherlands and in the UK, and had operations in Luxembourg. So you had these very different systems, unionization requirements, and presences coming together to create this real mismatch of cultures, outcome expectations. So actually, that taught me about the law, fine, but actually it taught me about how you can communicate effectively with stakeholders so that they understand and can come on a journey with you, and understanding how you take the elements of what you're trying to achieve and phrase those so that they speak to the interests and mutual benefits that you will get from other stakeholders. It was probably one of the most intense experiences of my life, but ultimately it's taught me a lot about how to operate, particularly under complex and crisis-driven situations, heavily deadlines.
Thank you very much. What do you think are the most important skills and qualities that successful legal professional must have?
So I think this is changing, more slowly in the private sort of private law firm sector than when you're in a legal position in house. But the most important thing I would say is it's not just about the document, and it's not just about the question on the page. And most people, when they come to you for advice, they don't want a memo of 50 pages that tells you about the last 50 years of case history evolving a concept that maybe gives you an answer. They want to understand how they can take a decision. And you can only give that advice if you understand the context. So, what that means for me is I'm not an accountant, I'm not an operational specialist, I'm not an HSE specialist, I'm not an HR specialist, but I know who to talk to and understand enough about those elements of an issue that allows me to understand strategically where best to give options and advise and recommend. So you cannot operate in a silo or an ivory tower. You have to understand what makes the business tick, whether you're external or internal, in order to give the right advice.
Thank you very much. How do you stay updated with all of the changes in laws and legislations?
So we have panels of law firms that we work with. Some of those providing more general advice, some of those more specialist advice. So we work very closely with them in order to stay updated to what's going on. I also spend a lot of time in government organisations and also with World Contracting and Commerce, which is a commercial and procurement organisation, to understand not just what the black letter of things are that's changing, but also to try and understand what it means in practice. And it's very important because although changes can be relatively slow, a lot of the stuff that's drafted has interpretation in it. So it's about advising how you best arm the organisation with the potential greys so it can take decisions.
Yes, thank you very much. What advice would you give to students struggling with transition from academia to professional world?
I would say you're going to have to recognise, and actually, there's maybe a bit of breathing and it's a cup of tea or a glass of wine, whatever takes your fancy. But going through academia acquires a certain set of skills, critical analysis, the ability to phrase an argument, the ability to convince, to balance. But actually, academia in and of itself almost forces an individual to go deep on everything because you've got to understand how you create the most persuasive and balanced argument. Understanding those skills is point one. Point two is you almost have to leave it slightly behind because most people in business, as I mentioned before, don't have the time for the 8-hour conversation or the 50-page memo. They just want to know the answer. And actually, one of the things that you'll find, particularly for non-functional colleagues is that they already trust that you have the legal understanding. You don't need to prove it. So there's a little bit of leaving that behind. They just want to see how you apply the knowledge they think you have to the situation to help them. And it's easy said, difficult done, situationally driven. But if you can start to think that way and constantly ask yourself, what's my objective here? What's the objective of the person in the room I'm looking at? And how do I bridge those and help them so that we have a mutual outcome that's going to work?
Thank you very much. What advice would you give to students who are struggling with stress, whether in personal life or like struggling with academia stuff?
So, what I would say is, look, when you're in the middle of your standard grades or hires, or when you're in the middle of your final exams in any year, or your final exam of honours, if you do honours, or indeed your ordinary degree, it can feel like the entire weight of the world rests on your results. Because if I don't get that, I'm not going to get into the right law firm, or in terms of law, I'm not going to get into the right companies. I'm not going to get the right level of experience. Financially, it's going to hurt me. The amount of people who I look at around me who are successful, they're not all sitting there with first class honours degrees. What they are sitting there with is an ability to have a high EQ, an ability to read the room, to influence stakeholders, to negotiate and understand and distill down, to speak to people, to help them make recommendations, to be part of the decision. And therefore, if you don't get what you want out of it, it's not the end of the world. Think about how you arm yourself to have that skill stack and the experiences you can have, because that will give you something else to offer that ultimately I think will make you a better professional than just having the academic background.
Thank you very much. What advice would you give to students trying to build their network? Maybe some of the professional events, something like that.
So what I would say is do it. There were a few I went to where I thought, why am I here? You feel a bit imposter syndrome about it, particularly when you will network with people, either students who feel like they have got it all together, and you're sitting there going, I'm well behind the curve here, I need to buck my ideas up, or professionals that are so experienced you feel you have to impress. Let that go, just go and soak up the atmosphere. A lot of the power I found in those kind of networking events is not going and talking, but just going and being around people and listening to what it is that they're saying, because it teaches you about the themes that are coming out from a conversation. It teaches you about the way people speak, and actually that will help you translate as you acquire the knowledge over time. And that, I think, was the most powerful lesson for me. Not about what the topic was itself, but just observing how the conversations flowed and thinking, well, how can I emulate or take from this in my own professional career at that early stage?
Thank you very much. Would you recommend a legal field for students?
Yes, but I would only recommend it if you're someone who's interested in what makes a business tick. At the end of the day, whatever kind of lawyer you are, it's about the client. Whether you are employed by the client, like I am as an in-house counsel, or you're an external lawyer providing advice. So if you're not interested in what makes a business tick, or the commerciality of an issue, if you're black letter law, then I would suggest be wary slightly of going into the legal profession, unless you're wanting to go into academia, which is a very different kind of field. But if you're really interested in how I take something from cradle to grave and how I understand how to get an outcome from something, not because the law is there, but how the law enables it, yeah, it's a great place to be.
Thank you very much. And what is your best, warmest memory from Aberdeen that you have?
Oh, it depends how many of them you actually remember in depth. There were so many good nights out. I think there are so many places. I was up in Aberdeen recently visiting our contract at North Links that have just gone. And I have such fond memories of the times I spent there. Graduation will always hold a special place in my heart. But I think also one of my best memories was during Freshers Week, and the first time we were all in halls together. Everyone, you realise, was there not knowing anybody really, and the way people just kind of meshed together, I thought that was beautiful. And the one thing I would tell myself now looking back is don't worry so much about other people, because they're all in the same boat as you. Just enjoy it. And actually, I would probably have enjoyed it even more than I did anyway.
Thank you very much. And the last question is, if you could go back in time, would you change anything about your experience as a student, or would you give yourself any advice?
Yeah, I probably would actually. I would tell myself not to worry so much. So, look, I consider myself lucky. I worked very hard for it, as those who do. I got a first class honours, which was kind of what I was aiming for,
Impressive.
which is great. But actually, I didn't need to work myself so hard. And actually, I probably would have spent less time worrying about the grades and more time just enjoying the experience, particularly as you got into years three and years four of honours, where it all felt really quite intense. But apart from that, I wouldn't change anything.